My uncle stole my grandmother's wedding ring from her deathbed. The probate court judge was not amused by his explanation. Grandma had been fighting cancer for 8 months when we all gathered at her bedside that Tuesday morning. The hospice nurse kept checking her pulse every few minutes, and we knew it wouldn't be long. My parents, my two sisters, and I had been taking turns staying with her around the clock. Uncle Mike had driven down from his place up north just that morning, claiming he wanted to say goodbye. The whole family had complicated feelings about Uncle Mike. He was my dad's younger brother, but they hadn't spoken much in recent years. Mike had a gambling problem that had cost him his house, his marriage, and most of his friendships. Dad had bailaid him out financially more times than I could count, but even family patience has limits. When Grandma finally passed away at 3:17 p.m., we all stood around her bed crying and holding each other. The hospice nurse gave us time to process everything before she started making the necessary calls. During those first raw moments of grief, none of us were paying attention to what anyone else was doing. It wasn't until the funeral director arrived 2 hours later that we realized something was wrong. The wedding ring that had been on Grandma's finger for 63 years was missing. The simple gold band with the tiny diamond had never left her hand, even during her hospital stays. She used to joke that they'd have to cut it off her finger when she died. We searched everywhere around the bed, thinking maybe it had slipped off during her final moments. The hospice nurse helped us look under the mattress, in the bedsheets, even on the floor. Nothing. That's when my sister pointed out that Uncle Mike had left about an hour earlier, claiming he needed to get back on the road before dark. My dad called Mike immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. We tried several more times over the next few hours with the same result. Dad left increasingly angry messages, but Mike never called back. The funeral director said this kind of thing happened more often than people realized, unfortunately. The next morning, Dad drove to Mike's apartment 3 hours away. The landlord said Mike had packed up and left during the night, owing 2 months' rent. His neighbors hadn't seen him, and his few remaining friends claimed they had no idea where he'd gone. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. We held Grandma's funeral without the ring, and it felt wrong somehow. That little piece of jewelry represented her entire marriage, her whole life with Grandpa. During the service, I kept thinking about how she'd twist it around her finger when she was nervous or thinking hard about something. The empty space where it should have been haunted all of us. For months afterward, we heard nothing from Mike. Dad hired a private investigator, but even that led nowhere. Mike had always been good at disappearing when things got tough, but this time felt different. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The estate proceedings moved forward without him. Grandma had left everything to be divided equally among her 4 grandchildren, with Dad handling the details. Her house, her savings, her few pieces of jewelry, all of it was documented and appraised. The missing wedding ring was listed as stolen property in the probate filing. 7 months later, I was scrolling through social media when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A local pawn shop had posted photos of their recent acquisitions, and there was Grandma's ring. The distinctive scratch on the band from when she'd caught it on a fence post years ago made it unmistakable. I called Dad immediately, and we drove to the pawn shop within an hour. The owner confirmed that a man matching Mike's description had sold the ring 6 months earlier for $300. He'd used a fake name and address, but the security camera footage was clear enough to identify him. The pawn shop owner was surprisingly helpful once we explained the situation. He'd dealt with similar cases before and knew the legal procedures. We filed a police report and provided all the documentation proving the ring belonged to Grandma's estate. The district attorney's office took the case seriously. What we discovered next shocked everyone. The police investigation revealed that Mike hadn't just taken the ring and disappeared. He'd been living in a motel 2 towns over, using the money from selling the ring to fund his gambling addiction. The $300 had lasted him exactly 4 days at the local casino. But here's where things got really interesting. Mike had been arrested twice in the past month for minor offenses, and during booking, he'd given his real name and information. The system had flagged him as a person of interest in our case. He was sitting in county jail on a completely unrelated charge when the detective finally tracked him down. The detective called Dad with the news on a Thursday afternoon. Mike had been arrested for trying to pass a bad check at a grocery store, which violated his probation from a previous gambling-related offense. He'd been in jail for 2 weeks already, probably having no idea that we'd found the ring. Dad and I drove to the jail the next morning. Seeing Mike through the glass partition was surreal. He looked terrible, like he'd aged 10 years in the months since Grandma's funeral. His hands were shaking, and his eyes had that hollow look that comes from hitting rock bottom. When the detective told him about the ring, Mike's reaction was nothing like what we expected. Instead of denial or anger, he just started crying. Not the manipulative tears we'd seen from him before when he was trying to get money, but genuine, heartbroken sobbing. He confessed everything without being asked. The story he told was both pathetic and infuriating. He'd taken the ring in a moment of panic, knowing he owed money to some dangerous people. The gambling debts had piled up while he was supposed to be getting his life together. He'd convinced himself that Grandma would understand, that she'd want to help him one last time. Mike explained that he'd originally planned to pawn the ring temporarily, just to get enough money to pay off his immediate debts. He thought he could win it back at the casino and retrieve the ring before anyone noticed. Of course, that's not how gambling addiction works. The $300 was gone within hours, and he found himself deeper in debt than before. The district attorney offered Mike a plea deal, considering his confession and cooperation. He'd serve 18 months in county jail and pay full restitution to the estate. More importantly, he'd be required to enter a court-supervised addiction program when he got out. The probate court hearing was scheduled for the following month. Dad had to testify about the circumstances of the theft, and the judge reviewed all the evidence. Mike appeared via video link from jail, looking even worse than he had during our visit. When the judge asked Mike to explain his actions, his response was rambling and incoherent. He talked about how sorry he was, how much he loved Grandma, how the gambling had taken over his life. He mentioned something about planning to make it right, about having a system that would have worked if he'd just had more time. The judge listened patiently, then delivered one of the most scathing responses I've ever heard from a courtroom. She pointed out that Mike had violated the most basic trust during his family's moment of grief. She noted that his explanation showed no real understanding of the harm he'd caused, only self-pity and justification. What really seemed to anger the judge was Mike's suggestion that he'd meant to return the ring eventually. She called his reasoning insulting to the court's intelligence and to his family's pain. The judge emphasized that stealing from a deathbed wasn't a temporary borrowing situation, no matter how he tried to frame it. Mike was sentenced to the maximum term allowed under the plea agreement. The judge also ordered him to write a formal apology letter to each family member, which would be reviewed by the court before his release. She made it clear that any future violations would result in much harsher penalties. Getting the ring back was emotionally overwhelming. When the evidence clerk handed it to Dad in that small plastic bag, we both started crying right there in the courthouse hallway. The ring looked exactly the same as always, but somehow it felt different now. It had been tainted by Mike's actions, marked by his betrayal. Dad and I drove straight to the cemetery after leaving the courthouse. We sat by Grandma's grave for over an hour, just talking to her about everything that had happened. Dad slipped the ring onto his pinky finger, the only place it would fit, and said he'd keep it safe until he could pass it down to one of his grandchildren someday. The whole experience changed how our family dealt with difficult situations. We'd always made excuses for Mike's behavior, always given him another chance because he was family. But stealing from Grandma's deathbed crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Sometimes people you love do things that are simply unforgivable. My sisters and I talked about it for months afterward. We wondered if we should have seen it coming, if there were signs we'd missed. But ultimately, we realized that Mike's addiction had progressed to a point where nothing was sacred anymore. The disease had consumed whatever moral compass he'd once possessed. The strangest part was how the whole situation brought the rest of our family closer together. Dealing with Mike's betrayal forced us to have conversations we'd been avoiding for years. We talked about addiction, about enabling, about the difference between helping someone and allowing them to hurt others. Dad struggled with guilt for a long time, wondering if he should have done more to help Mike before things got so bad. But my sisters and I reminded him that you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. Dad had tried for years to help Mike, but there's only so much one person can do. The addiction program Mike entered after jail seemed to help him initially. He sent the required apology letters, and they were surprisingly thoughtful and genuine. He acknowledged the pain he'd caused and took full responsibility for his actions. For the first time in years, his words seemed sincere rather than manipulative. But recovery from gambling addiction is a long process, and Mike had setbacks along the way. He'd stay clean for a few months, then relapse and disappear again. The family learned to love him from a distance, to hope for his recovery without enabling his destructive behavior. The ring now sits in a safe deposit box at Dad's bank, waiting for the right time to be passed down to the next generation. We decided that whoever receives it should know its full story, including the difficult parts. It's not just a symbol of love and commitment anymore, but also a reminder of how addiction can destroy families. Every year on the anniversary of Grandma's death, we visit her grave and talk about both the good memories and the painful ones. We remember her strength, her wisdom, and her unconditional love for her family. We also acknowledge the ways that love was tested, and sometimes broken by the people she cared about most. The whole experience taught me that family relationships are complicated, that love doesn't always conquer all, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries with people who are hurting themselves and others. It's a lesson I hope I never have to learn again, but one I'm grateful to understand. Looking back, I realized that Mike's betrayal was devastating not just because of what he took, but because of when he took it. He violated the sacred space of grief, the moment when families should be supporting each other through loss. That violation of trust was almost harder to forgive than the theft itself. The probate court judge was right to be harsh with Mike. His actions deserved consequences, and his explanations were insufficient. But I also learned that justice and healing aren't always the same thing. Getting the ring back was important, but it didn't erase the pain of what happened or restore the trust that was broken. Today, several years later, Mike is doing better. He's been clean for over a year and has a steady job in another state. He sends holiday cards and occasional updates, but he understands that rebuilding relationships takes time. Some wounds heal, but they leave scars that serve as reminders of what we've learned. The wedding ring story has become part of our family history now, passed down alongside the happier memories. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, truth eventually comes to light, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in dramatic confrontations, but in quiet courtrooms where justice is measured and deliberate. Grandma would have been heartbroken by what Mike did, but she also would have hoped for his recovery. She believed in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that people could change. Her ring is safe now, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can really ask for in this complicated world where love and loss, trust and betrayal, hope and disappointment all exist side by side.